Hi, I'm Samuel C. Spitali, author of How to Win the War on Truth. In this video, we'll look at the truth about the Second Amendment. Despite popular belief, the Second Amendment was not drafted to protect a citizen's right to self-defense, nor did it have much to do with national defense, as James Madison, the amendment's chief architect, knew that state-formed militias were too unreliable and ill-equipped to stand up to a foreign invasion. What the Second Amendment was really about was protecting those state-run militias from being dismantled by the federal government. Consider the language of the amendment. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Now remove the subordinate clauses and strip the sentence down to its subject and verb, and it's pretty straightforward. A well-regulated militia shall not be infringed. Since there was no standing army back in the 18th century, states would independently organize their own groups of armed citizens, i.e., a well-regulated militia. The Second Amendment did not authorize states to do this, but merely promised that the federal government would not stop them or infringe on their right to do so. But why would the government want to stop those militias? Well, the better question is, why did some of the states think the government might want to stop them? Because if the federal government dismantled the southern states' militias, they might try to dismantle slavery, because those militias were slave patrols who squashed slave revolts and hunted down escaped slaves. Because Madison needed the South's support to ratify the Constitution, he had to appease the slaveholders who controlled southern legislatures. So the Second Amendment became a safeguard to protect their militias, and in effect, protect slavery. Those militias were so reliant on firearms to maintain chattel slavery that 81% of slave-owning estates had firearms, and those with the most slaves were 4 times more likely to have guns than those with no slaves. Madison's compromise worked, and the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, was ratified on December 15, 1791. But the racial subjugation imbued in the Second Amendment wasn't limited to maintaining slavery. During America's frontier expansion, it was also a way for white people to eliminate indigenous communities and help themselves to their land. As America expanded west, the rifle was heavily used as a farming tool for ranching so that settlers could hunt wild game and kill predators that raided their livestock. But in the 2 decades after the Civil War, the Winchester rifle became fetishized for killing Native Americans, while the Colt revolver was celebrated for outlawry, the act of declaring someone an outlaw so that he's outside legal protection and can be shot and killed. Like former slaves and Native Americans. In the process, civilian massacres and gun violence were often glorified. Yet even despite the near genocide of Native Americans, there was still far less gun violence in the actual Wild West than there was in the fictional version that played out on television screens in the mid-20th century on shows like Gunsmoke and Rawhide, only 2 of the 26 Westerns on TV in 1959. This Hollywood-spun mythology of the Wild West, full of self-determined cowboys atop the gender and racial hierarchy, helped turn the firearm into a symbol of white masculinity. This worked out great for the gun industry. Since gun manufacturers had maxed out military contracts, they turned to consumers to expand their market share. Most countries prohibited this from happening, but not the US, where capitalism often trumped the public good, and the gun had long been viewed as a way to maintain the racial order. Gun manufacturers capitalized off the idealized myths of the Wild West, where, unlike in modern America, white men did not have to cede ground to the civil rights and women's movements. Since its inception, gun rights had long been divided along racial lines. During Jim Crow, many states made it impossible for black citizens to obtain a firearm license or carry a gun, and white terrorist groups like the KKK and the White League enforced black disarmament. In fact, the Ku Klux Klan began as a gun control organization that confiscated any guns that free blacks may have obtained. As the social order changed and black people became a more visible part of American life, racial anxieties led white people to view the firearm as protection from altercations with people of color that would never actually happen. As much as 90% of crimes are between people of the same race. But on the occasion when they did happen, often by wannabe cowboys taking the law into their own hands, gun lobbyists fought to protect not the victims, but the trigger-happy cowboys. They wrote stand your ground laws, which essentially made it legal to kill anyone with a firearm in the name of self-defense. Since the justice system is 10 times more likely to rule a homicide justifiable if the shooter's white and the victim's black, rather than the other way around, stand your ground laws serve as a form of racial vigilantism, most notably in the 2012 shooting of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman. States with stand your ground laws actually experience an increase in homicides. Today, the U.S. remains the only industrialized nation that treats firearms like any other consumer good, as easy to buy as bread or butter. And this has very little to do with the Second Amendment, but a lot to do with the National Rifle Association, which single-handedly changed how we view the Second Amendment. The National Rifle Association, or NRA, was initially founded in 1871 by former Union soldiers as a sporting and hunting association. They were concerned about soldiers' poor marksmanship, so the NRA supported the U.S. military by hosting target practice at shooting ranges and promoting gun safety, a vital public service at the time. In line with their mission, the NRA endorsed gun control legislation in the 1920s and 30s. They supported both the 1934 National Firearms Act, the first federal gun control legislation, and the 1938 Federal Firearms Act, which prohibitively taxed the private ownership of automatic weapons, introduced waiting periods for handgun buyers, required permits for anyone wishing to carry a concealed weapon, and created a licensing system for dealers. The NRA also supported the National Gun Control Act of 1968 after it became known that Lee Harvey Oswald purchased the rifle he used to kill President John F. Kennedy from an ad in an NRA magazine. The Gun Control Act banned the mail-order sales of guns, restricted the sale of weapons to felons and minors, required new firearms to bear a traceable serial number, and prohibited the importation of military surplus firearms like the one that killed Kennedy. In 1971, when a bill was introduced in Congress to ban cheap handguns called Saturday Night Specials, the NRA announced they supported it 100%. In keeping with their original mission to promote gun safety and responsibility, the NRA also supported a national registration system. But this position changed in the 1970s, when the NRA registered as a lobbying group and aligned its interests with that of gun manufacturers. At the NRA's 1977 convention, a faction of anti-government zealots took over the organization, and this once non-political entity took a hard right turn, aligning itself with the Republican Party and now financed by weapons manufacturers. Instead of promoting gun safety, the NRA now lobbied Congress to carve out firearms from any and all regulation. In 1972, they got Congress to exclude firearms from being regulated by the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which sets safety standards for commercial products. As a result, gun manufacturers have operated without federal oversight for nearly half a century, which means no federal standards for gun design, no governmental agency policing their safety, and no ability to recall hazardous designs or ban faulty products. In 1996, the NRA authored a rider on that year's spending bill that prohibited the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from studying gun violence or conducting research on the causes of gun violence, effectively eliminating science from the gun debate altogether. In 2004, at the behest of the gun lobby, George W. Bush allowed Clinton's assault weapons ban to expire, which allowed the sale of the AR-15, which allowed American civilians to purchase the same rifles used in Iraq and Afghanistan on the battlefield. And in 2005, Bush signed the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which shielded gun manufacturers from liability, giving them immunity from being held accountable for mass shootings. In 2010, again at the gun lobby's bidding, Congress included language in a funding bill that prevented military officers and doctors from even discussing firearm ownership with service members suffering from depression. Influencing legislation was only part of the NRA's efforts to expand the sale of firearms. They also needed to change public opinion by changing the meaning of the Second Amendment. No longer was the NRA's motto, firearm safety education, marksmanship training, and shooting for recreation, which once adorned its building entrance. Now they claim to be the foremost guardian of the traditional American right to keep and bear arms. In the 1980s, the NRA pushed the idea that the Second Amendment endowed individuals, not just militias, with the right to bear weapons of war, and they heavily funded new scholarship to promote this idea. Of 27 law review articles published between 1970 and 1989 that were favorable to this new interpretation, at least 19 were written by representatives of gun rights groups. During the 1990s, another 58 law review articles were written to support the position, and the PR effort continued. The NRA funded the group Academics for the Second Amendment, and they even sponsored an annual Stand Up for the Second Amendment essay contest. For generations prior, the courts had held that the Second Amendment related only to state militias and not to private gun ownership. But by 2008, the Supreme Court had been swayed enough by gun lobby propaganda that they rewrote decades of precedent. Now, the Second Amendment supported an individual right to bear arms. As is fitting for a lobbying group funded by arms manufacturers, in 1991, the NRA elected a professional lobbyist, Wayne LaPierre, to lead the organization. It was LaPierre who brought with him an increased focus on marketing and public relations, as well as fear-mongering. In 1993, President Clinton signed the Brady Bill into law, which required a 5-day waiting period when purchasing a handgun. By 1994, gun sales in the U.S. had been cut in half, dropping down to fewer than 4 million units per year. So the NRA spread fear that President Clinton and the left were a threat to gun owners, a made-up assertion that, surprise, surprise, increased gun sales as gun enthusiasts began to stockpile more guns. The strategy was so successful, it became a permanent part of their marketing efforts, whipping up their base at an overreaching federal government that wasn't. There has been no organizing effort to curb gun rights nor confiscate anyone's guns, but that didn't stop the hate and anger from being acted out in public. An anti-government white supremacist named Timothy McVeigh, who sealed his letters with "I am the NRA" stickers, blew up a federal building in Oklahoma City. McVeigh, just like the Unabomber, the Freeman Militia in Montana, and David Koresh and the Branch Davidians in Waco, was motivated by guns and irrational fears cultivated by the NRA and their cohorts and right-wing media. This frenzy of paranoia, paired with a broader white power movement bubbling up from the vitriol of talk radio, gave birth to a new militia movement of violent extremists. Nothing exacerbated this more than a black guy getting elected to the highest office in the land. So, coming full circle to those all-white militias who once maintained the racial hierarchy, the election of Barack Obama prompted an increase in militia groups from 131 in 2007 to 1,360 by 2012. By 2009, the Department of Homeland Security warned that these violent right-wing extremists had become the most dangerous terrorism threat in the U.S. But boy, were they good for business. By the end of Obama's 8 years in office, gun sales reached 101 million units, a 75% increase over the George W. Bush administration. And all those guns mean more gun violence. Today, because of our easy access to firearms, there's roughly one school shooting a week and one mass shooting per day. School shootings are now so common that there have been more in the 21st century's first 20 years than in all 100 years of the 20th century. While owning a firearm may give us the illusion of safety, statistics repeatedly show otherwise. A person is almost 3 times more likely to get murdered in a home that has a firearm than in one that doesn't. And although the gun lobby wants us to think that firearms are used for self-defense, research shows that a gun is 22 times more likely to be used in a criminal assault, an accidental death, or suicide. The majority of gun deaths, over 60%, are suicides, not homicides. And when homicides do occur, the vast majority, as much as 95%, involve people who already know each other. There are, on average, 37,000 gun deaths a year in the U.S. 2,000 of those are accidental, 12,000 are homicides, and more than 25,000 are suicides. Roughly once a week in the U.S., someone is accidentally shot by a toddler. Yes, a toddler. American children are 13 times more likely to die from a firearm homicide and 8 times more likely to die of a firearm suicide than children in comparable nations. The U.S. is home to only 4.4% of the world's population, but we own 50% of the firearms. More guns are regularly stolen in the U.S. than the number of gun owners in other countries. And there are more gun shops in the U.S. today than there are even McDonald's restaurants. The U.S. does not have more crime than other countries, but because we have more guns, our crime is more deadly. In fact, we have the highest rate of gun deaths of all wealthy nations, and most of the poor ones. These nations have the same violent video games, as well as the same rate of mental illness. What they don't have is easy access to firearms, which is the single biggest predictor of unnecessary gun deaths. While the rates of burglary, robbery, and aggravated assault are comparable to other wealthy nations, The US homicide rate is exponentially higher. Our murder rate by guns is 70 times higher than in England and 300 times higher than in Japan, where only 0.06% of citizens own a gun, and they are required to attend a safety class and pass a background check and mental health evaluation. And in Australia, which has enacted gun control, they've reduced mass shootings to 0 in the past 25 years. Simply put, guns lead to a type of violence that would not occur without them, which is why military personnel and police officers are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than firefighters, because cops and military personnel carry service weapons, and the presence of those weapons allow for irreparable harm when the impulse strikes. Oh, and the notion that the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun? Well, that's a marketing slogan developed by the NRA's advertising agency, Ackerman McQueen. It may sound like a policy solution, but it's not. It's just a sales tool, and boy does it work. After Wayne LaPierre spoke at a news conference in 2012 after the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre, NRA profits spiked by $100 million. Its membership increased by hundreds of thousands, and the week's gun sales reached nearly 1 million units, the highest ever recorded. A record that would be broken in March 2020, when during the COVID-19 pandemic, monthly gun sales reached a new high of 2.4 million units, nearly double that of the previous March. Putting aside the deliberate misrepresentation of the Second Amendment in the name of the almighty dollar, or its original intent as a compromise by the framers to uphold slavery, the militia referenced in the Constitution has now become the National Guard, a state-based military force that can be activated to become part of the U.S. military when needed, just like originally intended. Although, unlike those militias, the National Guard doesn't go around enforcing the racial order. That job is still reserved for law enforcement, which, fun fact, actually evolved from those very slave patrols that once hunted down escaped slaves. Meanwhile, the arms referenced in the Constitution, those long-barreled muskets of the 18th century that were damn near impossible to commit suicide with, and even less likely to commit mass murder since they only fired 2 shots a minute, have long been replaced by handguns and semi-automatics, making both suicide and mass shootings a daily occurrence. Probably not what the founders intended, but what today's lawmakers seem pretty okay with when they reiterate the NRA's talking points about the right to bear arms. Today, 84% of gun owners and 74% of NRA members support requiring a background check for gun sales, which is really the least they can do, considering that to go hunting, you must drive to the hunting grounds, which means you must have a driver's license, which requires passing both a written and a driving test. Your car must be registered, renewed annually, and pass emissions tests. Both you and the car must be insured. Regular safety inspections are required by law, and the car manufacturer is liable for its product. Plus, you have to have a hunter's license and a license for a hunting dog. The firearm is the least regulated part of the hunting expedition, with 0 restrictions. Yet the gun lobby resists any such measures, which means the politicians in their pocket fail to enact any reasonable legislation that would reduce the harm of these weapons. So as the gun industry continues to rake in billions a year in sales, the American public will continue to pay the price. If you enjoyed this video or know someone that would benefit from watching it, please share. And for more information and myth debunking, be sure to check out my book, How to Win the War on Truth. And thank you for watching.